Perfect. Uh, okay. So, as I said, I'm going to be exploring chapter 10 of Dr. Sax's book, and chapter 10 focuses on food security. So here are some of the guiding questions for this chapter. What are the different types of malnutrition? What are the trends in global food prices and what are the consequences? What are the environmental threats to food production? What are the problems with the current agriculture practices around the world? What can be done to move towards a sustainable development path in agriculture? And lastly, how and why we need to take responsibility for our personal health and the way we approach food as individuals. And here are some of the key terms and concepts from this chapter. I'm not going to go over all of them, but here are some like stunting, wasting, BMI, Willett's food pyramid, Engel's law, Haber-Bosch process, golden rice, and precision farming. And I'll probably like mention all of these as I summarize the chapter. So chapter 10 is it's broken down into 5 different sections. And the first section focuses on sustainable food supply and the end of hunger. And here Dr. Sachs kind of talks about the 4 underlying problems in the society and around the world regarding food security. And first, he talks about how a significant share of the world population today is malnourished. And he talks about 3 different types of malnourishment, which is 1, chronic hunger or undernourishment, which is when humans have insufficient intake of energy or calories and proteins. 2, hidden hunger or nutrient insufficiency, which is when vitamins or particular fatty acids are not adequately present in one's body. And 3rd, hidden hunger or nutrient insufficiency, which is 3rd, obesity. And he then talks about the effects of these effects of malnourishment, which he talks about which is like physical development that are being like irreparably damaged and humans having to face adverse health consequences as a result. And in terms of obesity, he talks about how in order for humans to solve this issue or like get closer to even solving this issue, more physical activity is required. The second problem he brings up is how the global population continues to grow in the current society, which means that obviously since there are more people, the food demand increases since more people means more people need to be fed. However, since there is also an increase in global food prices at the same time, there are less people who have access to these foods because it's becoming so much more expensive for people to access food, which means that which means that less people can access food, and they are eventually eventually a lot of people are put into malnourishment and hunger. And continuing on from this section, the third problem he talks about is how climate change and other environmental changes threaten food production, and how global food supply is constantly becoming destabilized, and how there is an unstable food production in today's society. And lastly, how the food system itself is a major contributor to climate change and other environmental harms. And these 2 points I'll eventually touch upon later. So the second section focuses on farm systems, ecology, and food security. And he begins this section by talking about how there are variations in farm systems across the world, and how different regions in the world have different farm systems, and how he says that this is the reason why there isn't a single like definite answer to how farmers can become more productive and resilient to environmental risks, because farm systems basically differ around the world. And he talks about how locations of cropland and forest shapes these systems. So for example, in temperate mid-latitude zones, which is currently being deforested for croplands and pastureland so that people can get like fuel, wood, and other goods and services. These kind of zones are kind of being focused for profit, where they're cutting down trees and replacing those areas with massive tree plantations to grow high demand products like palm oil. Meanwhile, like in seasonal tropical environments, food insecurity is like a really big thing because there's a low average rainfall and high vulnerability to droughts, which means that people who are originally settled in those areas like have to, or like kind of forced to move out. And as they move out, they encounter other ethnic groups who are also competing for the same kind of resources, like same scarce land and water. And this kind of like leads to an explosion in violence because they're like competing for the same resources. And then he talks about how in those areas, these violences are being responded with military approaches by Washington and NATO, but he also points out how there is a more urgent need to address the underlying problems of the origin of this violence, which is like poverty, climate change, and unsustainable population increase. And as he states this, he kind of calls out the military strategists in Washington and NATO, and he talks about how they kind of fail to see the human and ecological dimensions of this crisis and only kind of try to focus on getting rid of this issue and like trying to combat this issue so that they can get over with it and they can like forget about it. And the third section focuses on how environmental change threatens the food system. So the first environmental change Dr. Sachs talks about is population growth, which I mentioned before about how like the current food supply cannot feed everyone in today's society. And second, more meat consumption, where countries with rising incomes are kind of like more tended, or like they kind of like lie towards like incorporating more meat consumptions in their diet, which means that there's going to be a higher demand for feeding grains. And then he talks about climate change, which is a really big umbrella that leads to harder growth of food and agriculture processes. And under climate change, we have human emissions of greenhouse gases, like higher temperature, which leads to seeds becoming like infertile, and warming, which means that global warming, which means that the world will become drier and it will be basically impossible to grow crops because in order for agriculture to be successful, precipitation is necessary. And he also talks about rising sea levels and CO2 emissions, which acidify oceans. And once like oceans are acidified, it is known to kind of like damage shellfish that are living there, which also impedes the formation of calcium in our marine and marine systems. And he brings up the use of pesticide and herbicides to grow crops because pesticides basically poison the soil and it's a bad influence in our ecology. And he talks about invasive species, which are animal or plant species that are being deliberately or accidentally relocated from one environment to another, which kind of deranges the entire ecology, and it runs wild or overtake the native species. And then lastly, he talks about a really big problem, which is water availability, especially fresh water that are being overused for crop irrigation. And he talks about how currently in places like Yellow River in northern China, major rivers are being overused to the point that they're not even flowing to the sea. And the fourth section talks about how the food system threatens the environment and how food production itself is the most important single driver of environmental harms. And he establishes 3 different pressures that are being generated by agriculture. One is GHGs, greenhouse gas emissions, and he discusses how the farm sector is actually the major emitter of the major 3 GHGs like CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And 2, he talks about nitrogen cycle, the use of nitrogen fertilizers and creation of ammonia, and how people are using a lot of nitrogen to grow crops because nitrogen is essential in plant growth. And he talks about how once these nitrogens or like chemical-based fertilizers are put inside soil so heavily, it's going to change the intensity of pH, and it eventually creates like a really big nitrogen flux in the environment, and it can harm other ecosystem and like the nearby environment as well. And lastly, he talks about the habitat destruction. He talks about how humans are destructing our habitat for other species using their own hands. And lastly, Dr. Sachs kind of tries to end in a positive note where he discusses how we can move toward the sustainable global food supply. And he first begins with talking about how if we continue as business as usual, or BAU, which basically means that if we continue to do the things that we currently do, it will only increase food insecurity and further damage our environment, and it's not going to do any good. He talks about, and in order for us to kind of move away from the BAU, we have to follow this idea called sustainable development trajectory, or SD trajectory, and he talks about how in this trajectory there are varied responses, and it is actually carefully tailored to local contexts where each region can identify its own pathway, because as I said before, every single region is different in their own way, so we have to kind of figure out so they have like different agriculture practices. So first he talks about how in this trajectory, it allows for us to improve the ability to grow food through natural plant breeding or genetic modification, so basically using technology. And second, making crop varieties to be more nutritious, which is also using technology. And lastly, precision farming or information-rich farming, where we are using a more precise application for fertilizer, so more food are being produced with less environmental impact, which can allow for a better nutrient management, like better soil testing, soil mapping, and like trying to figure out like being able to like and having access to detailed nutrition of the soil needs, and also improving water management and better harvesting, storage, and transport of crops. However, with all these technology that is available in current society, he also talks about, and he actually puts the main emphasis on taking personal responsibility, where humans take personal responsibility and are responsible about the diet and how they should be eating healthier with a balanced diet and making better choices when with their agriculture practices and when they're farming. And I would like to end this presentation and summarization on a note by stating one of Dr. Sachs's quote, where he says, "Not only are we coming to realize that a large portion of humanity is poorly fed, but we are also realizing the seriousness of the threats to global food security that lie ahead." So I hope that this quote and my presentation, or like this summary, kind of allowed you to like realize the gravity of food insecurity in today's society. And I hope you can also take personal responsibility and like greater responsibility of your diet and just generally your livelihood. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. That was really awesome. There's a lot of detailed information. That's great. All right, I'm going to quickly introduce Dr. Joaquim Goes, and then we'll get right into it. So Dr. Joaquim is a biological oceanographer whose research is focused on understanding carbon cycles in the oceans and the structure and functioning of plankton ecosystems as they respond to global warming and climate change, as well as ocean acidification, as Ashley was mentioning, and hypoxia. He started his career at the National Institute of Oceanography in Goa, India, and then moved to the Bigelow Laboratory for Ocean Sciences in Maine, United States. Currently, he is the professor at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observatory, Columbia Climate School, and Columbia University at New York. He holds a master's degree from Bombay University in India and a doctorate from Nagoya University in Japan. Dr. Joaquim also mentioned to me that he would love to have an open participation style for his presentation. So I would really encourage everyone to open up their cameras and raise their hands, open up their mics and ask questions. We're going to extend a little bit into the Q&A session for this as well. So don't feel as though you're holding anything up. Definitely come off your camera, definitely come off your microphone, put questions into the chat, and I'll let Dr. Joaquim say the rest.
Thank you, team. Can you see my slides?
Yes, you can.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Radhika and Hayan, for the invitation to speak today. And thank you, Ashley. You set the stage nicely for me to talk about the oceans and the changes that we are seeing in the oceans. So you know that 75% of our globe is covered by water, the oceans, the seas, and about 25% is land. And Ashley spoke about how, as we move into the future, disruptions to our climate, to our weather patterns will affect food on land, food production on land. And that is going to result in a lot of food insecurities all over the world. And so as climate changes, I anticipate that we will slowly be relying on the oceans to produce most of our food. So at the moment, we produce about 20% of the world's, the seas provide about 20% of the world's protein requirement. And I think as we move into the future, and as people start moving away from inland to coastal regions, as we see now for their job security, and that's happening all over the world, whether you go to China, you go to India, people are moving towards the coast. That's where all the jobs are available. So a lot of people will depend on the sea for their source of food. So today, I'll start this talk by transporting you to a region of the world where about 2/3 of the world's population is affected by this little ocean that is present here. So I'm going to talk about this little region over here that is called the Arabian Sea. And you can see the footprint of this, the real estate occupied by this little ocean is very small compared to, say, for instance, the Atlantic Ocean, if you see over here, or the Pacific Ocean. It's very, very small. One thing that I want you to note over here is that unlike the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, of which the Arabian Sea is part of, this entire region is called the Indian Ocean, is landlocked. Okay, so it is landlocked to the north. And so unlike the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, there's no free exchange of water happening across from the tropical and temperate regions into the polar regions, especially the Arctic Ocean. Now, this is a map showing the world's population distribution. And you can see that this region, because it controls the rainfall patterns over this region, which is India, the Indian subcontinent, and most of Southeast Asia. And in this region, about 2/3 of the world's population resides. So any changes that happen in this ocean downstream of this region, and I'll talk about the monsoons in a little bit, has a huge impact on the food security in this region. So if there's a failure of the Indian monsoons, you will see that, that it affects crop production or agricultural production. And when that happens, it destabilizes the entire world. It has a huge ripple effect on the economy in many, many countries, especially those that are affected, but the rest of the world as well. So, and this region is really the gateway, the Arabian Sea is the gateway to the Middle East where we get most of our oil from. So any insecurities over here, whether it's wars that arise out of food insecurities or water securities, can have a huge impact on the energy supply to the rest of the world. So this area is very, very important. And I'm often asked the question, you're working in a US lab, and why should you be working in the Arabian Sea, which is so disconnected from here, from the USA? And why should the US government be spending money in this region? But there's a reason for that. Any disruptions in this region has a huge impact on the rest of the world, on food security, energy security, and also stability in the region. So how many of you have heard about the monsoons? I would like to ask the audience this. And if someone can even post in the chat and tell me what monsoons mean. So because today I'm going to talk about the Arabian Sea and the Indian monsoon, okay? So anyone ready to answer online? If not, we can move forward. Tim, is there anyone who has responded?
People are saying in the chat that they do know what monsoons are. I'm waiting to see if anyone can tell me because I'm not very well versed. anyone can come on to the microphone even and tell us.
I live in Japan, so we like frequently experience monsoons, but they're typically like periods of very like high intensity, like rainfall and wind.
Yeah,
Yes,
monsoons are a rainfall.
fantastic. Yes, so this rainfall patterns, monsoons are actually winds, okay? And these winds that blow over the ocean is what drives the moisture from the sea to the land. And these monsoons are responsible for bringing in rainfall to many, many countries. It's the word monsoon comes from an Arabic term called mausam. And so they were the first to talk about the monsoons. And it is apt that these winds are called the monsoons. Okay? So the Indian monsoon is very, very peculiar. It is the only monsoon that reverses the direction of the winds. And here what you're seeing on the right, which is the animation over here, is at some time of the year, you see the monsoons blowing from the southwest direction up northwards, okay? And during winter, you see the monsoons reverse their direction. You can see the winds coming from the landmass to the sea. So this is one thing that is very, very unique about the Arabian Sea monsoons, is that you have a seasonal reversal of these monsoonal winds. Okay. So this winds for an oceanographer like me is what drives the current systems in this region. So because of the way in which the winds blow in one direction or the other, they alter the circulation in this water. Okay, so when it's blowing from the southwest, you can see the water color. This is the sea surface temperature, and the blue color indicates colder waters. Okay, so this entire region during the southwest monsoon becomes cold. Okay. And during the northeast monsoon, you can see a little part of this portion becomes cold as well. But the Arabian Sea is a tropical ocean. It is warm throughout the year. But during these two periods, during the southwest monsoon and during the northeast monsoon, it becomes a little colder. And the reason why it becomes colder during the southwest monsoon or the summer monsoon is because of a process called upwelling. Okay, you can see these waters. The ocean circulation behaves in such a way that if the winds are blowing in this direction, the waters move at right angles to the wind direction. Okay, and this process is called Ekman pumping. So the Ekman pumping will pump away the water away from the coast, but at the same time, it brings the water from below to replace it. And this process is called upwelling. Okay, where you have colder waters coming up to the surface, and these waters are rich in nutrients. And in the same token, as I will show you in the next slide, is how these winds coming out from the mountain affect and make these waters cold. Okay. So this intensity of the winds is actually regulated by the pressure difference between the land and the sea. And this pressure difference is controlled between how hot the oceans are or how hot the land is. So during summer, you can see we have very little snow in the Himalayan Tibetan region, okay? And the Indian subcontinent becomes very, very hot during summer. And because it becomes very hot, it becomes a region of very, very low pressure. And the seas are slightly cooler. So the winds, they blow in this direction because of this pressure gradient from a high pressure region to a low pressure region. So, and as I said, as these winds blow in this direction, they cause a process known as upwelling along the coast of Somalia, Yemen, and Oman. And this, what I'm showing you here below these arrows, is the color that we see from the space. And these colors tell us how productive these waters are. So you can see during this period, you have a lot of phytoplankton in the water, and this phytoplankton gives rise to fisheries. And it's really important for fisheries. Now, contrast this with the winter. In the winter, you'll have a lot of snow in the Himalayan mountains. The Indian subcontinent is colder than the surrounding seas, okay? And because it is colder than the surrounding seas, this becomes a high pressure region, and the seas become a low pressure region. So the winds come out from the Himalayan Tibetan mountains, and they blow over the Indian subcontinent and eventually over the Arabian Sea. And these winds coming out from the mountains are really very, very cold. They're dry, and as they blow across the oceans, they take away the ocean's heat. And this heat removal makes the waters very cold, and they make them denser. And as they become denser, they sink down, and they cause what is a process called as convective mixing. I'll try and explain this better because this is really the basis of the Indian monsoons, the summer monsoon and the winter monsoon. Okay? So in this area too, you see that there is an increase in chlorophyll that takes place. Okay? So because of a process called convective mixing. And this both upwelling and convective mixing give rise to these large plumes of phytoplankton. And these large plumes are largely made of organisms called diatoms. And if you go to the fish market during the summer monsoon or the winter monsoon in any of the countries around this region, you'll find that you'll find mostly sardines and mackerels, which are the big pelagic foods that these diatoms support. Now, this is a time series map of air temperature anomalies over the Eurasian subcontinent. Now, this is over entire Europe as well as Asia. And you can see this data goes back from 1960 to 2018. Okay? But these are anomalies. So a zero measurement of anomaly will tell you there's been no temperature change over the past few years. Okay? And so if you look at the past, temperatures were very, very cold by at least half a degree in the past up to about 1998. We have had spikes from time to time, but this was short-lived spikes, okay? But since 1998 or so, the oceans have, the air over Eurasia has been rising, the temperatures of the air. And so we have seen since 1998, we are seeing an increase in air temperatures over the Eurasian continent. And this year in particular is very, very hot. Europe is hot. United States is hot. Our temperatures are about 3 degrees higher than normal. And that's why we are feeling this heat and humidity that we are experiencing now. But this has been going on since 1998 and it has continued. So we have not seen a decrease in temperatures like we've seen in the 60s to the 1990s. Right now we are seeing a continuous increase in temperatures from year to year. And because of these temperature increases, so this is the snow cover extent over the Himalayan mountains, okay? And this is again, the area of the mountains that is covered with snow. So in the past, this is again anomalies from 1967 to the present day. You can see in the past, we used to have a lot more snow in the Himalayan mountains, okay? And since 1998, we have seen a consistent decrease in snow cover extent. So if I give you some, we have lost about 200,000 square kilometers of snow cover over the Himalayan mountains. And just to give you some perspective, this is roughly around 3 times the size of Texas that we have lost the snow cover over the Himalayan mountains. So this has been having a huge impact on the monsoons, and we see this manifest in the form of erratic rainfall. So every year since 1998, India has been experiencing this erratic rainfall. 2009, 2014, I'm just giving some example, 2015, 2018, this year too, in India, we have floods all over. In 2014, we had a river change its course, and you see that this was in a town called Patna in Bihar, in central India. The river came gushing through the main city and took away temples, and you can see some statues floating away. In 2015, this was in Kashmir, where you saw there was the cloudburst and it washed away some huge parts of the city, and this was in South India. And this year, we are having these floods in New Delhi, where one of the rivers has started overflowing and it is threatening the lives of many, many people. But today I'm going to talk about what is happening in the sea, okay? So since 1997 to the present, okay, and I'm giving you data just from 3 different years. So this is the color of the ocean that we can see from space now, thanks to satellite technology. And the reds and the yellows and the greens that you see here are false colors, but they tell you how productive these waters are. So since 1997 onwards, the Arabian Sea is becoming more and more productive. So it is containing more and more phytoplankton. You would think that this is really, good for the environment. But what has been happening, there's so much of phytoplankton being formed now that most of it goes unconsumed by the higher trophic levels like zooplankton, and it sinks down. But in the process of sinking down, it is sucking out the oxygen from the system. And I told you earlier, the Indian Ocean is the only ocean that is not connected to the Arctic, okay? So because this landmass is locked by a landmass, there's no free exchange of this water. The water recirculates over here, and as we move into time, there's more and more oxygen being sucked out from the system. Okay, so this is happening during the southwest monsoon. So just to put it in perspective to you, so in the past we had more snow in the Himalayan mountains. Okay, you had a colder landmass. The pressure difference between the land and the sea was weaker, and you had weaker southwest monsoons. Okay, and when you have weaker southwest monsoons, you have weaker upwelling and less phytoplankton in the water. Okay, now one thing that I want to mention to you is that the Arabian Sea has a permanent oxygen minimum zone. Now this oxygen minimum zone is like a dead zone. We have this in the Gulf of Mexico, we have this off the coast of Peru, and over the entire planet, these oxygen minimum zones are spreading because of the warming that is happening. Okay, but in the Arabian Sea, this oxygen minimum zone is spreading very, very rapidly. So, and the reason is because of this, okay? So we are seeing there's less snow in the Himalayan mountains. There's a stronger land-sea pressure gradient. We are getting stronger southwest monsoons, more rainfall in India. But in the sea, we are having stronger upwelling happening off the coast of Somalia, Oman, and Yemen. And you have more phytoplankton in the water. And I said, there's nobody to consume this phytoplankton. We should have seen more fish, but instead we are seeing that the oxygen minimum zone is expanding. So this higher productivity is contributing to the spread of hypoxia. And this is connected to the warming of Eurasia and the loss of snow in the Himalayan Tibetan mountain. Now I'm talking here about the southwest monsoon. Now, if you go to the winter monsoon, okay, I said that the winds come from the land to the sea during winter, okay? So you can see the winds coming from the land to the sea, they pass over the Himalayan mountains. They're colder and drier. And because they're colder and drier, they take away the heat from the surface of the ocean. Okay, this water becomes denser and it sinks down, okay? And as it sinks down, the water from beneath comes up to the surface and it fuels this phytoplankton because it contains more nutrients. So this was in the past. And this is what is happening now. We have less snow in the Himalayan mountains, as I showed you. The winds coming out from the mountains are warmer and more humid. And we have this weaker convective mixing. So what would you have expected? Less phytoplankton, okay? Okay, so we have got data that shows that the winds, the air is warmer now than ever before. The winds coming out are warmer as well. And the humidity, the amount of moisture the winds contain is becoming more. So they're, instead of being dry, cold winds, they're warm, humid winds now. And this is affecting the circulation in the Arabian Sea. I won't go into details over here, but just to reiterate the fact that in the past it was like this, where we had colder and drier winds, stronger winter convective mixing, and more phytoplankton. And this is what we are having. We should see less phytoplankton. So this is pretty straightforward. Unfortunately, if you look at the chlorophyll concentrations, which is an indication of what we measure from space, if you measure this over the entire Arabian Sea, you can see that instead of going down as per this yellow line, okay, we are seeing that the chlorophyll is going up and up. and so much so that it has increased about threefold over this past from 1980 to 2018. So this results really surprised us as a biological oceanographer. And so if you look at this from space, you can see this how the Arabian Sea during the Northeast monsoon was very less productive in the 80s, and coming to the 2000 and all, it is becoming more and more productive. So these reds indicate that this area is becoming more and more productive. Of course, you see interannual variations, but just to give you an idea that this is roughly 3 times the size of the India that you see over here. It is becoming so productive. And we collaborated with Indian scientists to understand what was causing this increased productivity. As I said, we should have seen a decrease in productivity. We should have seen this yellow line, but instead we were seeing this increase in productivity that we see also in the satellite images for the winter. And what we saw, our ship occupied this area over here, and what we saw, the color of the oceans, which should have been blue, was green completely, okay? And you can see the satellite image which guided where our ship should go. And we used this to guide where we could sample, and we could see this area was green. And this is like turbid water that you would see along the coast. If you dropped a bucket in the water, it would be covered with this green mass that you see. And if you looked at this in a beaker, you could see that this thick blooms in the water. So if you tried to drop a net, it would look like a pea soup. So this really surprised us. And when we looked closely at the sample, this was the organism that was dominating the entire ecosystem. Just a single organism that has overtaken the entire ecosystem. It has destroyed the diatom blooms that we have come to expect. And instead, the diversity of diatom blooms that we used to experience in the past has been replaced by this single monoalgal kind of organism. Now, this organism has got peculiar features, and I'll try and show you. So this is organism, phytoplankton normally photosynthesize. Okay, so that's how they capture their food. They take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they produce organic matter. This organism can do not only photosynthesis with the help of these tiny little microorganisms that you see inside, but it can also capture other food. Okay, so it can capture all phytoplankton in the water. It can also capture zooplankton. So it's destroying everything in its path. It is a peculiar organism that has shown no mercy to this ecosystem. Now, it turns out that this tiny microorganisms that are living within it is an organism that is a green algae, which appeared on our planet about 1.2 billion years. Okay, so the first organisms that produced oxygen for us on our environment were cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. But this organism, this green algae, followed them about 1.2 billion years ago, and they also started producing oxygen. So they evolved, these organisms evolved in an environment that was low in oxygen and high in CO2. So I told you the oxygen minimum zone is expanding. Oxygen poor waters are also associated with higher CO2 waters. So this organism appears to be finding a perfect niche to spread and multiply. So as the Arabian Sea loses its oxygen, this organism is spreading. And I said that it eats everything. So it's eating up the diatoms. You can see it in their food vacuoles. Other zooplankton cannot consume it because it's slightly larger than normal. And it also has got this habit of eating zooplankton as well. So it not only feeds on phytoplankton, it eats what was supposed to be its major prey. So you can see this zooplankton eaten by this Noctiluca. So this organism is called Noctiluca. It's also known as sea sparkle. And sometimes if you go to the beach in Southeast Asia or in Oman, you can see the water changes blue. You can see like this bioluminescence on the surface. And the only organisms that can feed on this jellyfish and these organisms called salps. And here you can see the Noctiluca in their guts, okay? And you see them slightly being impacted by the accumulating in the guts of this organism. And this is what you see after a Noctiluca bloom. You'll see a lot of salps along the coastline. What I want to show you is the country that is most affected by this Noctiluca blooms is Oman. You can see almost the entire winter season from December onwards to February, you can see these Noctiluca blooms. They are green in color, sometimes they change to orange, okay, and golden yellow, but they're occupying the entire Arabian Sea. So you can see in 2023, this is from February of this past year, you can see Noctiluca blooms all over the Arabian Sea. And this is what it is causing to the food chain, okay? So Noctiluca is not giving rise to fish as we have come to expect. Instead, it's giving rise to the salps and jellyfish. And the only organisms eating these salps and jellyfish are squid, calamari, as well as turtles. So you can see this is along the coast of Oman. This is in the Straits of Hormuz. This is Oman over here, and it's the southern part of Oman along the coast. And you can see what fishermen are catching today is mostly this jellyfish, okay, instead of fish. And you can see these are the intake channels for many of the desalination plants. And this is a far away shot. But if you look at it very closely, you can see an engineer trying to clear this jellyfish from the channel over here. So these channels are completely blocked. They block these intake channels for the desalination plants, for the refineries, and for many of their coastal industries. So it's a threat to their energy security, it's a threat to their water security, and it also affects aquaculture farms and many of their fisheries also. So it affects food security as well in the sea. And I said this organism is spreading really rapidly. So this is a picture that was just sent to me earlier in March, and you can see that soon after Noctiluca blooms, this is what happens, dolphins dying along the coast. I could show you some more of lobsters also dying. So this is what the food chain was in the past. We would have phytoplankton mostly made up of diatoms, and then it would be grazed by zooplankton. We would have fish farming. So this is the classic food chain. And you would have detritus farming. You'd have few turtles feeding on this detrital material or sometimes on fish or calamari. But today the ecosystem has changed. Instead of phytoplankton, we are having mixotrophs, these organisms that can do both photosynthesis and they can feed on other stuff. So they're called mixoplankton. So they feed on phytoplankton, as I showed you, they feed on zooplankton. And instead of giving rise to fish, we're seeing jellyfish. And then we have a food chain that is completely altered. We are seeing more squid, and you're seeing more turtles over here in this region. So in Oman, they're seeing more landings of, instead of fish, they're seeing squid. And in the Middle East, squid is not a preferred food. So the prices of fish have gone up. And so it is affecting the availability of food locally as well. So what do we do with this information and how can we help? So we have been working very closely with this government of Oman to develop this forecasting system to predict the onset of these blooms. Because if we can predict the onset of these blooms, we can tell their local managers, okay, you have a bloom coming, you need to start conserving water. Okay, or you can move your aquaculture farms from one place to the other, which will not be affected. So we have developed this real-time forecasting system, not only for ocean currents, but also for Noctiluca blooms. We also can forecast the weather conditions. And I'll give you some examples of what we've done. I won't go into details of this, but we take all the satellite imagery that we got. We have got this model over here, and people send us information from time to time. It comes into our system over here called DISCO, Decision and Information System for the Coastal Oceans, or for the coastal oceans of Oman in this case. And we fuse all this data and we serve this data to them to focus harmful algal blooms, to focus sea state. And this is how you would look at this information on the screen. So you can see the distribution of phytoplankton in the water. You can see the ocean currents. You can see the temperature of the oceans. And you can use this information actually to forecast the arrival of the blooms. And I'll give you some examples of how we do that.
Dr.
So-
Joaquim?
Sorry.
Sorry, just so you know, we have about 10 minutes left, and I just have a couple questions, I think, from the chat that they maybe wanted to hear. Some of which have been answered, and some of which I think there was one by Senna.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence of ecosystems managing to successfully adapt to these climate change-induced changes? For example, the lack of phytoplankton or more phytoplankton, or are we past the point of no return? There were some questions about whether the green color organisms can do photosynthesis, and you explained they can do both eating and photosynthesis. And I think the next question is whether the organisms make the ocean animals and plants die due to lack of oxygen by taking the oxygen and modifying the food chain, or are there other ways that they can impact? So just those couple questions, sorry.
Yes, these are fantastic questions. Okay, so they are not a preferred food for many organisms. So the only things that feed on them are salps and jellyfish. And as I showed you, it's altering the food chain. And instead of seeing fish now, we are seeing squid, turtles increase in this region. Now, they are also altering the amount of oxygen in the waters as well, because unlike plant that produce oxygen, these organisms, they produce more carbon dioxide than is necessary. So they are sucking out the oxygen from the system and they're depleting the oxygen even more. So as we move into the future, we'll see more and more of these organisms. And as far as, I think in 1998, we crossed the tipping point. The ocean ecosystem in the Arabian Sea has shifted and we have reached a point of no return over here. So we have to learn to adapt to how this changes. And one way we can adapt to these changes is try and develop some kind of systems where we can actually start looking at how we can use the information. Now, in this case, you can see that we are using the ocean currents over here. So if we see a bloom in the satellite image, say around this time, okay, the people in Oman can drop these particles, these artificial particles, assuming that this is where the bloom is formed. And you can see the time of arrival of this bloom that is formed first offshore. You can tell at what time it will come to the shore. So based on this particle distribution, you can do that, okay? So this gives the managers some time to prepare for this eventuality where they have large jellyfish blooms, which clogs their intake channels for this desalination plants and also for their refineries. So they can take some action. And now in Oman, they're building large reservoirs that are underground and also exposed to the earth. So they want to conserve as much water as they can. So this is one tool. These blooms also result in fish mortality. And this is one that occurred after Noctiluca bloom. You can see all the sardines in the waters died. And they thought that the bloom was toxic, but actually it was due to something known as so I said that we have a lot of upwelling that happens here. And when upwelling happens along this coast, there's a lot of oxygen poor water that comes up from the deep up to the surface. So with the help of our model, we could tell that this was not due to a toxic algal bloom, but this was low oxygen water that was being pinched away from the coast. It was taken by the currents, and you can see the currents taking this water right into the Sea of Oman and dumping it here along the coast of Oman. And it was dumping it into these bays where there was no oxygen in the water, and you could see there was a lot of sardines that were killed. Because this model is coupled to the atmosphere also, we can predict cyclones with this model also. So as you know, the Arabian Sea is more prone to cyclones now. So our model can predict the paths of the cyclone. In this case, this was in 2019. There was a cyclone that formed off the coast of India. There was back-to-back cyclones actually. There was one that was heading towards, both were heading towards Oman, but we had predicted that the first one that was heading right for this part of Oman, Muscat and all, that it would change its course midway and head towards Yemen. And if you see what we had predicted about 7 days in advance, it showed that this cyclone changed its path and it headed south towards Yemen and Somalia. And the other one that was heading towards Oman, soon after that, instead of going towards Oman, it hit the coast of India. So we have developed these tools for them to help them manage their infrastructure, their water needs, their food needs. And so we are hoping that we are helping in some way to avoid this problem. So I'm going to end here. This is how, as I said, that the amount of turtles along the coast of Oman has increased. And this is work done by a student where she took data from turtles that were tagged, and she used this information to show how these turtles migrate from an island here in the Indian Ocean towards the coast of Oman. So all of them are moving to this region in search of food, jellyfish, as well as salps and squid. Now, as I said, this thing is spreading all over, and this is what happened in India in 2018. Okay. Just so that you know that this is not a problem that is unique to Oman, but to the India as well. So you can see this green algae floating. This is Lamont-Doherty again. And this is what it is causing in India. You have massive fish mortality. And you can see this is also causing sardines, to come along the coast. So people think that they're having a better harvest of sardines and mackerels, but what is happening is that the oxygen minimum zone is spreading. It is coming up to the surface and it's constricting their habitat. So all the sardines will be coming to the surface, but the waves, they wash them to the shore. And this is what people are collecting. This is in my hometown in Goa, India. Yeah. And this is my last slide. These blooms can be seen from space, and you can see they look pretty from space, but they're causing huge damage to the environment. And so this is a quote from Bryant Bigelow, who was the founder of the largest oceanographic institute in the United States, and it was the first oceanographic institute. He presented this to Congress in the 60s, and he was trying to demand some money for oceanographic research, saying that this is an interconnected world where our oceans, our atmosphere, and our food are all connected. And we need to study this in order to predict future changes. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so
I'm
much.
happy to take some questions, okay?
Yeah, so there's one in the chat that I saw. How can we prevent the spread of these organisms which causes damage to animals and plants, which in other words translates to, how is your job going to address these issues and adapt, like you said, because we are past the point of no return. And then there are some other questions about the other areas of the world where this happens, like the Gulf of Mexico, Tampa Bay, and any place that has a low oxygen, high CO2 condition. Are they at the same risk for these organisms?
Yeah, so one of the closest water bodies to us here in New York is Long Island Sound, which experiences oxygen depletion during the months of summer. So the oxygen concentrations at depth decrease very much. And that is a combination of the rainfall that takes away a lot of fertilizers from the land. And you have something known as combined sewer outflows. Sometimes these sewage treatment plants, they overflow and all the organic matter comes into Long Island Sound. And when that happens, there's a lot of oxygen lost in the system because bacteria start impacting, it gets attracted to the organic material and it sucks out the oxygen. So you have a rapid loss of oxygen. So what are the solutions for this? And it's a really difficult problem. We have done some experiments in the lab with Noctiluca. And we are the only lab in the world that has this organism in culture. So last year, we worked with some high school students, and believe me, a high school student found a substrate that can stop Noctiluca from growing. Now, the challenge for us moving forward is how do we apply this to the natural world? You know, as I said, that the size of the bloom is almost about 3 times the size of India, okay, or roughly 3 times the size of, 8 times the size of Japan, or 2 times the size of Texas. So it's a huge challenge to use that substrate over this entire region. So just like you have forest fires, we are thinking that, you know, when a forest fire starts, it starts in a small place. So if you can douse the fire at the point of its origin, you can stop this fire from spreading. And so we know that this organism forms off the coast of Oman and then slowly spreads as the season progresses to the rest of the Arabian Sea, and it comes down to India, Kenya, Tanzania. So if we can stop the organisms in the Sea of Oman, we think that we can solve the problem. But this is still challenging. And just yesterday, day before yesterday, we launched a project in Morningside Park in New York City, which is being afflicted by another kind of harmful algal bloom. The Morningside Park has got a small pond, and for the past 5 or 6 years, they've been having this algal bloom problem that makes the water completely green. And it's also a toxic algae. So that Morningside Park, we think, is really a nice test bed to test some of the techniques that we develop in the lab. So using that as a test bed, we'll be working with some engineers to try and solve the problem in the small water body, take it to Central Park where you have a larger water body, and eventually take it to the oceans where we can solve a larger problem. But it's going to be challenging. It's not going to be easy.
Oh, wow. All right. If anyone has any last questions that they want to get out, please do so. If not, I will begin closing the session and thanking everyone for showing up. And I want to say that this was really, really fun for me to facilitate this. And thank you to Dr. Joaquim. Thank you to Ashley as well. So I'm looking forward to this Thursday when we have our day-to-day. And I'll swing it over to Radhika or Hayan if they have anything else to add.
Nothing else to add. Just wanted to thank Dr. Goes. It's great that we are able to see some insights, because when we see some phenomena occurring and we are like, okay, why are these fish dying? What is happening? So I think this answered a lot of our questions. So thanks for bringing those highlights in. And also for all the eco ambassadors, it's great to see all your questions. Definitely keep sending your questions. So that we can keep engaging in this topic and keep, listening to all our speakers as we go along, and we'll have a better understanding of how interlinkages are existing, and how do we want to look at it in a much more holistic and comprehensive way. So thanks for joining today, and hope to have many more engaging discussions as we go along with our rest of the Eco Ambassador program. And thank you, Professor Goes, as well as Ashley, who've been here discussing and sharing their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. Yeah.
If this is spreading to the Bengal Sea, the Bay of Bengal Sea.
Yeah, so in the Bay of Bengal, we've seen it along the coast, along the Indian coast. And there are some parts of Thailand and then the Philippines, Indonesia, they are all affected by this. Vietnam, Cambodia is impacted by this organism. So it is spreading, and we've recently seen reports from Seychelles, which is further down in the Indian Ocean, past the equator, where you've started seeing these Noctiluca blooms. So, but it's still not spreading at the rapid rate that we are seeing in the Arabian Sea. As I said at the outset, that the Arabian Sea is one of the fastest changing ocean ecosystems on our planet outside of the polar regions. So yeah, it's a bellwether organism, and it is telling us something that the Earth's climate is changing and we need to do something about it. So this tiny organism is trying to tell us something. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much again. We're going to sign off for today and hope to see you guys Thursday. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.